This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Storyworth.
During the Middle Ages, there was a persistent myth among Christian kingdoms that there was a mighty and wealthy Christian kingdom far to the east that was surrounded by Muslims and pagans and led by the legendary leader, Prester John. As European discovery went farther, the Portuguese became convinced that this kingdom was the Kingdom of Ethiopia, an ancient Christian kingdom on the Horn of Africa. It's little surprise, then, that when the Ethiopian Empire found itself near destruction at the hands of a Muslim invader, that the Portuguese found an excuse to intervene. It is a little-remembered battle between very different peoples on the Horn of Africa that deserves to be remembered. You know, history deserves to be remembered, but that isn't just world history. It's also the history of you and the people that you love. So thank you, Storyworth, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Just the other day, I was chatting, I mentioned that time when I spent a decade as a collegiate speech coach, and my daughter, who's 18, about to graduate high school, said, "Dad, I never knew you did that." Isn't that weird? It was a big part of my life, but it was before she was born. I guess I just never mentioned it before. And it made me think, what do we really know about our parents? What did they never bother to tell us that would mean so much to us? And that's where Storyworth comes in. This is a book we got from my mother-in-law back in 2021. We paid for a subscription. About every week, they would send her a question, things like, what was your dad like when you were growing up? Or what was your first big trip as a kid? She could take as long as she wanted to answer. Some of the answers are longer, some are shorter. We could give follow-up questions. She could add pictures in. At the end of the year, you get this nifty book. One comes with the subscription, but you can order as many as you like if you want to give them to your siblings or to your family. We did this as a Mother's Day gift for my mother-in-law, but also for my mother at the same time. And I learned a lot of things. Some of it really tells you a lot about history. My mother never watched television when she was growing up because her family didn't get a TV set until she was in college. I didn't know that until Storyworth. The first time that she got a car was after she married my dad. So times have certainly changed. Both my mother and my mother-in-law, they're really amazing people, and Storyworth really helped us understand how they got to be the amazing women that they are. I also learned a lot about my grandparents that I didn't know, and so now I'm doing it. Every week I get questions, and the year we'll get a book that I can give to my kids because I want them to know where they come from. And I tell you what, I sure wish I'd done it with my dad while I could. There are just so many stories that deserve to be remembered that are forgotten. So save them while you can. Look, it's a great gift. Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, anniversaries, or just because you're thinking of them. Click the link in the description to get $10 off your annual subscription and hardcover book. The legend of Prester John was based on a report by Bishop Hugh of Gebel in Syria in 1145 to the papal court, as recorded by Bishop Otto of Freisling in the 1145 work Chronica. The reports state that John, a wealthy and powerful priest and king, was reputedly a lineal descendant of the Magi who had visited the Christ child, and who had defeated the Muslim kings of Persia in battle, and intended to proceed to Jerusalem, but was impeded in the last goal because of difficulties in crossing the Tigris River. The idea of a great Christian ally in the East was of great interest to Europeans, especially in the period of the Crusades. Initially, it was generally thought that this kingdom was in India. As European exploration pushed further into Asian and African spheres, it became clear that no magnificent Christian kingdom existed in India, and the idea of finding an ally like Prester John was in fact a driver of exploration and colonialism. Europe was aware of Ethiopia, and it gradually became the prime contender for the real kingdom of Prester John. Marco Polo referred to Ethiopia in his writings when he returned from the East, and in 1306 Ethiopian ambassadors arrived in Europe. In a record of their visit, Prester John was named as the head of their church. The legend was important in establishing connections between Portugal and Ethiopia. Henry the Navigator, the patron of Portuguese exploration, included the idea of making contact with Prester John as one of the strategic reasons for sailing down the African coast. In 1428, there was even talk of a strategic marriage between the Ethiopian and Aragonese royal families. By 1507, the Portuguese were present in the Indian Ocean, and the connections began to grow. The regent queen of Ethiopia, known to the Europeans as Helena, sent an ambassador to King Manuel I of Portugal and the Pope in hopes of an alliance against growing Muslim power. They reached Europe in 1520. One of the Portuguese members of this expedition wrote a book, A True Relation of the Lands of Prester John of the Indies, referring to Ethiopia, and even presented a copy of it to the Pope. The medieval empire of Ethiopia, also called Abyssinia, was a kind of descendant of the ancient empire of Aksum, and the Ethiopian emperors claimed direct descent from the Aksumite kings. Their greatest connection, however, was that of the Christian religion, which the Aksumite king Ezana converted to in the 4th century.
Over the next 1,000 years, the power and territorial extent of the various kingdoms and states of the Horn of Africa shifted significantly, but the territorial core of the Ethiopian Empire remained in the highlands of modern Ethiopia. After 1270, Ethiopian kings began an era of expansion, especially against Muslim powers along the coastline of the Horn of Africa. Multiple sultanates and kingdoms were incorporated into the empire, while others were forced to pay tribute. In 1332, Ethiopian armies invaded the Adal Sultanate, causing significant damage. Toward the end of the century, the Ethiopians invaded again, this time declaring the Muslims their enemies of the Lord. Sometime in the first decade of the 15th century, the Ethiopians defeated the Adal armies, captured the king, sacked the capital, and forced the royal family to flee to Yemen in exile. In 1415, Sabr al-Din III, son of the captured king, returned to Adal to reclaim the throne. Adal and Ethiopia continued to fight, but by the end of the century, the Ethiopians were unquestionably on top, having defeated the Adalites and forced them to pay tribute. New threats, however, were on the horizon. The Muslim Ottoman Empire was on the rise, which is what led Queen Regent Helena to dispatch her diplomats to Portugal. The Ottomans were expanding rapidly and conquered Egypt in 1517. Growing Ottoman naval power in the Red Sea brought it into conflict with the Portuguese and their bases in the Indian Ocean. In 1529, Adal forces made a campaign dubbed the Conquest of Abyssinia under Imam Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as the Left-Handed. The first major battle was fought on March 9, 1529, and while the exact numbers of soldiers are subject to some debate, as are the locations of any of the following battles, the Ethiopian army was apparently much larger than the Adalite. One man present at the battle wrote that each of the infidel lines was 5 times bigger than that of the Muslims, who were like the white birthmark on the hide of a black bull. But despite this, the battle was a lopsided defeat for the Ethiopians. The exact reasons for the defeat are also a matter of some question. It's often said that the Adalite cavalry outmaneuvered and defeated the Ethiopians. Historian Richard Panker suggests that the Adalites also had a company of elite matchlock men using firearms, and if so, it would have been the first time that Ethiopian soldiers had faced the new technology. The same witness records how many thousands of the infidels were killed. God alone knows. Despite victory, Adalite casualties were similarly large, and they withdrew from the highlands. The matchlock weapons used here and later in the war were likely arquebuses with matchlock triggers, which allowed the shooter to light the gunpowder using a burning piece of cord or twine rather than use a match by hand. While not muskets in the modern understanding of the word, the term actually predates the gun that we know as a musket and initially referred to heavy arquebuses that could pierce armor. These weapons, usually called matchlocks in Portuguese sources, were often also called muskets after 1521. 2 years later, the Adalite army embarked on another invasion of Ethiopia with even greater success. In a series of decisive battles, Ethiopian forces were devastated by the Adalites, especially by the use of artillery from the Ottomans, who panicked the unprepared Ethiopian forces. An Adalite writer recorded that the land was covered with corpses, and the blood ran like streams. The city of Aksum was besieged, and thousands were killed. The imam was sent to order the Ethiopian priests to be eaten alive by hyenas. The empire was in tatters and facing annihilation. The new emperor, Galadius, sometimes called Claudius in European sources, was 18 years old when he took the throne in 1540, and he reached out a desperate hand to the nearest Christian ally, Portugal. Vasco da Gama is famous for being the first European to sail around Africa and reach India, and therefore began Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean in 1498. Da Gama's sons had gone to India in the 1530s, and in 1540, Estavo, or Stephen da Gama, was made governor of Portuguese India. He was joined by his younger brother, Cristavo, or Christopher da Gama. On December 31st, 1540, the da Gama brothers sailed from Goa to attack an Ottoman fleet at the Suez. Stephen left some of his men at Massawa in modern Eritrea before sailing to attack, hoping to catch the fleet on the beaches. The whole plan was a failure, as the Ottomans had received word of the attack, and Stephen was forced to retreat to Massawa, where he found that his men there had been in contact with the Ethiopians. The young emperor saw the presence of the Portuguese so near to the battlefield and with significant force as a sign of divine providence. He just needed to convince them to send aid. In the surviving accounts, the Ethiopian emperor is nearly always referred to as Prester, reflecting the Portuguese belief about the empire. Stephen resolved to send a force of 400 men armed with matchlock muskets. Christopher collected a large number of weapons, 1,000 matchlocks, 1,000 pikeheads, and much powder, bullets, and lead, as well as artillery. 4 Falcon swivel guns, 12 bases with their carriages, and 10 very good bombards. Among the men were skilled laborers, including crossbow makers, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, shoemakers, armorers, and other handicraftsmen. In all, it represented an incredible commitment of force, expertise, and materiel. At the time, the emperor was living practically as an outlaw, with fewer than 100 men in the wilderness. Christopher's men spent the summer months awaiting the end of the rainy season before marching further into the highlands. They also brought the queen, the emperor's mother, under their protection. They left half of their equipment at an arsenal and finally met the Imam's troops for the first time in February 1542 at the Battle of Bacenta, where the Portuguese easily seized an Adelite hill fort. The queen had advised against attacking before da Gama could meet up with Ethiopian forces, but da Gama was concerned that leaving the hill fort would demoralize the locals, whom he relied on for supplies. The 400 Portuguese defeated a force 3 times their size at the fort, losing only a few men. The attack did alert the Imam to the Portuguese presence, and he marched on the Portuguese force. The Imam, who the Portuguese often refer to as the King of Zila, located da Gama and sent a messenger, ordering the Portuguese to leave, join him, or be destroyed. They presented a monk's habit as well, meant as an insult. In response, da Gama set a pair of eyebrow tweezers in a mirror, meant to imply that the Imam was a woman. He also told the Adelite that on the next day they would see what the Portuguese were worth. The Imam had a much larger force, some 15,000 infantry, 1,500 cavalry, and around 200 Turkish arquebusiers. 2 battles were then fought on April 4th and 16th. In the first, the Portuguese wounded the Imam himself and forced them to withdraw. The Portuguese attacked the Adelite camp next, apparently to great effect. A Portuguese writer who was with da Gama wrote that the victory would have been complete this day had we only had a few hundred horses to finish it. The Imam was forced to withdraw and now faced growing resistance from the populace, which refused to provide supplies. Da Gama pursued, finally setting up camp to wait out the rainy season. A local Jewish man, possibly a member of the native Jewish Beta Israel, informed da Gama of a poorly defended fort with horses nearby. Needing the horses, da Gama seized the fort, but when he returned to the camp, the situation had turned dire. The Imam had appealed to the Ottoman governor in Arabia, and in return for much money and submission, received 2,900 musketeers, including 900 picked Ottomans. Da Gama found himself without much recourse and heavily outnumbered. Instead of attempting to flee, he decided to make a battle. At the end of August, then, the 2 forces met decisively. According to Richard Stephen Whiteway, who translated and published a book of 70 contemporary and eyewitness accounts of the expedition, the Portuguese tactics appear to have consisted of a series of rushes of small bodies of men to drive the assailants from a threatened point. Whiteway argues that this tactic exhausted the small Portuguese force and required the small groups of men that were attacking to then withdraw back to the Portuguese lines, where they were shot down. By evening, Christopher had been injured twice, his standard captured, and he had lost 4 out of 5 of his captains and half his men. The palisades had been ordered built on the hill were captured, and the enemy within the camp proper. What was left of the Portuguese force, along with the Queen, were forced to retreat towards the captured fort. Da Gama was forced to leave most of his supplies, cannon and muskets included. The retreating Europeans were given a head start then, as the Adelites focused on looting the camp. Sometime during the night, da Gama, whose arm had been broken by a musket ball, was separated with a few men from the main force. They were captured by the Adelite forces, supposedly thanks to an old woman who directed the pursuers to their hiding place. British historian Clements Markham claims that da Gama had stayed in the rear because he was searching for a local woman that he had captured that he had become infatuated with. Only about 170 Portuguese survived the battle. Whatever the exact details, Stephen was brought before the Imam himself, and the Imam produced the tweezers that had been given and began plucking da Gama's beard. The beard was then lit aflame, and supposedly the Imam himself cut off da Gama's head. The accounts of da Gama's death are somewhat dubious, as they include a number of supposed miracles where his blood was spilt, a miraculous spring was said to appear that could cure the sick. Simultaneously, in a monastery miles away, a tree uprooted itself without apparent cause. This was a significant choice on the part of the Imam, as the Ottomans had demanded the captured Europeans be brought to them, as captured nobles could be used as bargaining chips in the ongoing war with the Portuguese. Offended that they were denied, the Turks departed, though it is possible they were merely dismissed, as the Imam felt he no longer needed their services. One account has the Turks coming to demand gold, but whatever the reasoning, the Imam would come to regret the absence of those troops and their advanced weapons. The emperor, with his small retinue, reached the hill fort where the remaining Portuguese had retreated, along with the queen. When he heard of da Gama's death, he wept. Surely for a son and heir he would not have shown more grief, according to a witness. The remaining Portuguese were not as defeated as the Imam might have believed, however. They were able to rearm themselves using the weapons that they had stored earlier and pledged their service to the emperor if he would help them avenge their fallen leader. With the promise of their aid, Gelasius was able to recruit a much larger force as he traveled through the country. According to a Portuguese chronicler, many who had turned to the Imam when the emperor seemed lost now came back before him asking for forgiveness. Some were executed, but others were pardoned because, as the chronicler wrote, had he ordered all to be killed, we would have remained alone. With a large force now at his command, he marched to engage the Imam, who was camped near Lake Tana. Midway through February 1543, they met with the Imam's forces in a skirmish and captured several Adalites, who told them where the Imam was encamped. Exactly where in this region the Ethiopians met the Adalites is not known, but the emperor was prepared to bring a final engagement and end the conflict once and for all. For several days, the two camps skirmished with cavalry before Galadius decided that he was risking the desertion of his whole army. The Ethiopians were likely still outnumbered, with around 8,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 130 Portuguese, 60 of those on horseback. The Imam's army consisted of around 14,000 infantry, 1,200 cavalry, and 200 Ottoman arquebusiers. The opposing forces met, with the gunmen placed near the front. The Adalites, with more men, attacked the Ethiopian flanks and initially appeared to be winning, but according to a Portuguese witness, the Portuguese then charged them, slaying many and driving the rest back. The 60 Portuguese horse worked marvels, and the display inspired the Ethiopians to redouble their efforts. The Portuguese matchlock men focused their fire on the Turks, causing heavy casualties. The Imam himself attempted to turn the tide, leading a charge against the Ethiopian front. They came so neat that he was recognized by the Portuguese, who turned their guns against him. In several of the accounts, a particular man, John the Galician, pushed his way quite among the Moors and discharged his matchlock into the Moor king's breast before he was overwhelmed and killed by the king's guards. In another account, it isn't known who fired the killing shot, but what is certain is that the Imam fell from his horse, dead. With their leader killed, the Adalite force broke up, and the Ethiopian victory was near complete. Only 40 of the 200 Turks escaped, taking the Imam's wife and much of the treasure that the Adalites had captured in their campaigns. Only 4 Portuguese were said to be killed. According to an eyewitness, the Ethiopians came to kiss our feet and worship the Portuguese, giving them the credit for winning the battle. The battle ended the war, the Imam's son was captured, and the empire restored.
The war weakened both sides and allowed other powers, such as the Oromo people, to rise. It also didn't end the conflict between the Adal Sultanate and the Ethiopian Empire. The Adalites invaded again in 1559 and killed Emperor Galadius in battle. But a second invasion in 1576 failed, and the Adal Sultanate essentially disintegrated. The Ethiopian Empire, however, survived into the modern era, repulsing many Ottoman invasions, and the core of that empire still survives today in the modern state of Ethiopia. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.